Coming back to Unconditional Surrender World War II in Europe. I think I'm just trying to pick it up. I've come back to the game after leaving it overnight, and I'm just in the process of recovering the situation after some fairly severe cat damage overnight. They had decided to play with the counters and the plexi, and I've had to do quite a lot of reviewing of old video footage and going back over stuff that I've seen to try and put the game state back together, because they really had a very good play with it. I can't guarantee that it's exactly as it was, especially in areas along the Eastern Front. I'm still trying to put it together again in certain areas where the counters just are all over the place. And yeah, the joy of owning cats and war games rears its ugly head, and usually my cats are pretty good and they don't tend to mess around too badly with the board and take too much interest in it, but every now and then they get slightly skitty and chase each other around the house, and at that point I think the war games table becomes fair game and anything can happen. And as it happened, I got back to the board and everything was all over the place. And I also, rather sadly, I'd already lost one counter, and it just vanished one night. It was a free forces marker for the Allies. Well, I came back and this weather counter, you can see it there looking rather sad, so one of my cats had clearly taken an interest in that and decided it was edible, and I found that on the kitchen floor, nowhere near the game board. So yeah, there it is. So I've sort of constructed. There were a lot of spare chits in the that came with the game, sort of, just blanks with multicoloured stripes on them where printing crossed over and stuff. So there's a new ad hoc weather counter. So if you ever see I have this game up for sale second hand, don't buy it, because there'll be replacement counters all over the place. I have no intention of selling this game, by the way. That was just I was just messing around. I think I like this game far too much to want to sell it again. I may have to buy a second copy, sadly, just so that this one can get beaten up and ruined and eaten by cats, and I can have another one. So, see, there they go again, destroying part of the kitchen. Hold on. Well, that's all I had to say, really. So the game state hasn't really moved on. I was just whinging about my feline companions and their ability to destroy my games. So yeah, when it comes to this is presumably still in print and still available, and I don't feel so bad about it, but when I come to some of the OCS titles where they're quite hard and expensive to get hold of, I'm not sure I want my cats eating the counters. That might upset me substantially more, especially, I've also lucked out in that they've been eating reasonably generic stuff, weather markers or a little free forces counter. But if they decide to just go and eat the 8th Army or something, all of a sudden I'm going to be less than impressed. Anyway, there it is. Still pushing on and still waiting to see how things turn out. I don't feel particularly confident that we're going to make it through to July 45 here. I think that's really unlikely. I think the game's going to finish before then, and I think it's most likely that the German defences crumble either here or up over here. This central area on the front is looking extremely precarious. So the Germans have got some real problems here. But anyway, let's not second guess it. Let's just see how it goes. Beginning of August 44 in Unconditional surrender, and you can see the Germans really are under severe pressure now. I think the 2 turns of early weather, of good weather early in the year, May and June both being great weather across Europe, just allowed the Russians and Americans and British to chip away, and now we're in good weather, guaranteed good weather turns, July and August and September, and they're feeling the effects of that. You can see the Americans have made inroads here, and the Americans have taken Frankfurt, I believe, in there under that armour, and the British have taken Aachen there, and that's not just costing the Germans national will, that's costing them factories as well, production, bombs all over Germany there as well. Germans desperately trying to find some breathing room to rebuild some units. They've got flipped units on the board, quite a number of those, where they've had to rebuild. And over here on the Eastern Front, things didn't go quite so badly. In fact, they had some very hot dice over here on the Eastern Front, and a lot of these Russian units ended getting flipped over. They got, I think the Germans got something like 5 attacker attrition results, where the Russians were throwing 1s and the Germans were throwing 6s, and they were just stopping a lot of the Russian advances in their tracks. They did break through this and break down these encircled units here. 3rd Panzer did escape from that encirclement and made it back to its own lines, but was eventually taken out by multiple Russian attacks and finally bit the bullet somewhere down here, just north of Belgrade. But otherwise, the Germans had a pretty good turn of blunting the Russian attacks, and are still holding pretty much the terrain they were in. But you know, they haven't got enough production at the moment to rebuild all their lost units and to reflip units that have become disrupted during combat, and to reorganize their air. So they are having to, you know, make compromises, and a lot of the time now they're not able to put air power up, and that is going to cost them, and sooner or later that's going to catch up with them, because the Russians are going to get their air force organised again, and likewise with the British and Americans. They've got some pretty serious air superiority over there. You can see one of the RAF fighter command there doesn't even have any sorties on it at all, and that can just be throwing +2s into these British armour as they attack. I've got a surprise attack marker still there on the board, so that can come off. But yeah, so the Germans just about hanging in there. This is looking extremely grim, and this is looking only moderately grim, but it's not looking great for the Germans in terms of holding out for the entirety of 44. But I'm going to play it out, because I mean, the Germans just absolutely diced the Russians this turn on the Eastern Front, and they could easily do it again to the British and Americans on the Western Front. So let's just keep going on, because it's fascinating to see whether they'll crumble or whether they will manage to rebuild sufficiently to get some robust defences back in place. Looking forward to seeing how it goes.
moving into September 44, and the Germans really teetering on the brink here now. The Western Allies, British and Americans, have punched their way through a lot of the defences here. You can see they've taken Dusseldorf and they've moved into Germany here, and they're costing the Germans factories and national will, and the defenders are just looking pretty thin on the ground, and the Germans are having to spend all their production points trying to build, and then you know, they build reduced units, and then you have to wait a turn and then build them again to flip them over, and so they've just got all that armour that they lost a couple of turns ago back onto the board in a full state, and it looks like this lot is going to have to get thrown towards the American and Western Allies to try and hold on there. They just don't have the production anymore to keep the Luftwaffe flying, so it's build units and mobilise a little bit, or put the Luftwaffe together, but they can't do both. Over here on the Eastern Front, they have held the Russians roughly along this line here. I mean, it's pretty shaky and pretty tenuous, but the trouble is that the Russians are just slowly grinding and killing units, and even that is costing national will. Between them, the Russians and the Western Allies have been destroying German units at the rate of about 6 a turn for the last 3 turns, and that, combined with taking some cities and forcing their way into Germany, has dropped German national will down here onto 7. I know it was 30 or 32 a few months ago, but that has just been eroded and eroded and eroded as the Germans lose units at this kind of rate, and all of a sudden it's looking very, very precarious for the Germans. They have got September to survive, and then desperately hope for some severe weather and an opportunity to stop this this just horrible attack from grinding into them. But yeah, there's really, I'm not sure. I don't fancy their chances of getting through this month with their national will intact. I mean, it's probably just about possible, given that they have finally got some reinforcements rebuilt, but I don't really like the look of them surviving with only 7 national will, because they'll either lose units, or because they've got too many garrisons like this that are just easy prey for armour with air support, just to knock off a point of national will each time you run into one. And it's just horrible situation that they've got to try and defend this situation. So it's all fallen apart, and the game could be over this month and possibly next, unless something pretty miraculous happens on the German behalf. So anyway, let's play it out to the bitter end and see how it goes, but I think it's probably all over, bar the shouting. So September 44, and the German activations just happened. They've moved as much as they can up to try and solidify this line against the Western Allies. A lot of armour in here. They've managed to counterattack the 2nd Panzer Quarter German armoured unit with no retreat paths in Stuttgart, and managed to repeatedly attack it with some air support that the Germans put together, and retook Stuttgart, and that cost the Americans their first point of national will, their first loss, and bumped the Germans up a couple. So they're now on 9 national will. They do have reinforcements sort of appearing in their cities, but they're very, very short of production. They've got 12 production points left. They've got stuff across the board that needs points spent on it to flip it over, and then they've got another however many points worth sat here on their mobilisation pool. 1, 2, 3, 4,
5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 10 production points there to go on. They don't even have the cities to put them into at the moment. And of course they've got 5 or 6 air units on the board, which would be costing 3 each to take sorties off. So they've probably got, if they had the production points, they could probably comfortably spend 40 next turn just on just on rebuilds and replacements, mobilisation. But they are currently, I think, sitting around the 22-24 mark in terms of production points, and that's without moving anything. So they really are in desperate straits here, and at the moment it looks like just a question of how long it takes either the Allies or the Russians to get another big breakthrough, and that could happen at any time. Of course, this is September going into October. We could start seeing some very bad weather, and it might become a little bit easier for the Germans. Usually the production points, often there's spare kicking around, so that might give them a little bit of leeway in the bad weather. But as I think I said before, the Western Allies and the Russians are just going to have to keep pressing, irrespective of the weather. The Russians have got enough production and enough units just to keep grinding and sod the weather. So I think that's what's going to happen. But it's all about whether the Germans last the turn or not. So I'm about to go into the Allies and then the Russians and look for every single possible way of taking a point of national will off the axis here. Let's see what happens. Well, it's all over. The Germans couldn't hold on. September 44 is the final turn of the game. We didn't make it into 1945, but it was cracking good fun nonetheless. The British in this last turn managed to bully their way forward here and take Bremen, throwing in airdrops and free forces and partisans to undermine the Germans, and the Germans no longer able to really afford to any sort of air support. Just gave the attackers, these British and Americans, a bit too much strength just to push forward, keep grinding them back, and pick off the odd garrison or whatever, or a unit that wasn't able to retreat, and they just chipped away. And by the time they'd finished, the Germans only had two national will left, and so the Russians barely moved. Just this armour in here moved forward and pushed that German unit back, and then attacked diagonally back into this hex here to kill a unit for failure to retreat. And then all this motorised pushed forward with the aids of some tank counters and some partisans, and just laid siege to Königsberg and again took that. German unable to retreat, and that was all over. So there it is, the end of Unconditional Surrender World War II in Europe. I had wondered whether the Germans were doing enough, or whether they should have gone harder, or whether they'd not quite got the balance right between the Eastern and Western fronts, and I really don't know the answers to those things still. I'm going to have a good old think about it, but I think it's already got my mind whirring, thinking about what I could have done better with the Germans and Italians. I certainly feel I completely ballsed up the Mediterranean theatre as far as the Axis is concerned, just leaving the Italians to get on with it. It turned out the Italians weren't really capable of getting on with it. I have no idea what that strange noise was from my kitchen. Slightly worrying. Anyway, turns out that the Italians had absolutely didn't have enough in the tank to cause trouble for the Allies down in North Africa, and perhaps I should have really tried to push harder. I also think that there's a possibility that bringing the Italians into the war as early as they came in, which was 1940, just gave actually played into the Allied hands a bit, because at that point the economic warfare hadn't really started to bite against the Great Britain, and they still had quite reasonable levels of production and were therefore able to play with their navy and their forces down in the Mediterranean quite effectively, whereas by late 41 their production was down to 10 or 12 and they were really struggling to get anything done at all. And had the Italians been coming in at that point, this fight between the Royal Navy and the Italian Navy might not have been as unequal as it was when the British have the resources to pay for their navy. But it was pretty one-sided. But I think that was largely because the Italians took Great Britain on at a time when Great Britain still had resources available to pay for this, and so perhaps there's an element of mistiming there on the Axis part, and they should have tried to hold off and wait and get the Allies into the war later, once France has fallen and you've got these and the Germans have got a port into the Atlantic, and they've got an air unit up in Norway, and the +3 bonus from that and the economic warfare means they're winning the economic warfare every turn against Britain and just destroying it economically. And then you put the Italians into play once the British can't afford to fight. And you might then put a serious attack into Egypt, and then of course that can really keep the economic war turning in your favour, and you might just cripple the UK economically, and that might prevent, in the long run it might mean that this kind of thing takes much longer for it to materialise, because or maybe it doesn't materialise at all, because the British, it just takes too long for the British to be able to afford it. So and this American army without the British in there, it's very hard to maintain with only 4 or 5 units. It's very hard to maintain sort of supply back to your ports. The Germans could just be slipping units in behind without this lot here, and cutting all the supply lines back to the convoys, and threatening to overrun these ports just with rubbish garrisons. They'd never put any threat on Germany, because they'd never make it out of France with a protected supply line. I'm rambling now, but I'm just thinking about when you've just finished a game like this, you just start to analyse and think about all the things that you could have done differently, or maybe, and I think this timing issue with Italy is certainly a very interesting one, and something I could definitely see playing differently. I also think, in addition to that, I didn't quite understand the sort of alliances and rules for getting things on your side, or nor did I pay enough attention to sort of allying or conquering things down here in the Balkans and into Greece. And Bulgaria never entered the war, but Greece, critically, I think the Axis needed to make some sort of judgment about Greece as to either trying to tip it onto their side, so that they can use Crete as some sort of base, or conquer it so that they can use Crete as some sort of base. But either way, they needed a better base in the Mediterranean somewhere over here, and I think Crete is it. And
by the time the Axis had realised that the Italians were getting, overrun, it was too late to really start diverting the forces and material that you need down here. And of course it doesn't help that the Germans have absolutely no navy whatsoever. They've got a surface action marker which is next to useless, and not a lot else. So that didn't help their cause either. I don't think they did a bad job against the Soviets, to be honest. I think, in late *44, I don't think this is particularly bad to be holding them on a line from sort of Königsberg down through Prussia and Poland and into the Balkans, into Hungary and Yugoslavia, down to Belgrade. I think that might be considered fairly reasonable, but I think over here the fact that the Western Allies just had the beating of the Italians and then the ability just to grow into France and set themselves up for these attacks and all the time and air power and supply that they could ever ask for. I think that was really costly for the Germans' chances. So there it is. Yeah, fabulous game. Really, really, really enjoyable. I'm now in the mood for something substantially shorter though for a little while before I get something else on the board that's going to take this kind of time and commitment. This has been on the table for about a month now, and I'm absolutely delighted to have played it to completion, and also now really looking forward to having this space so that I can play something that takes an afternoon or a weekend instead, set some smaller things up. Got some musket and pike to get onto the table for a change of pace and a change of style, and to move away from World War II for a bit, and possibly Fire in the Lake at some point, the Vietnam coin series. I think I've got a feeling I might, and also some OCS to get back into World War II. I'm going to start playing some OCS stuff. So I think I'm going to be trying to sort of intersperse those. I don't think I'm going to jump into some. Well, I'm not sure actually with regards to the OCS. I don't want to just jump. It's going to be my first time playing that as well, and the fact that OCS has some slightly smaller scenarios and some smaller sets means that I don't have to just dive straight into some huge monster campaign. I could just pick a scenario out of one of the boxes, Tunisia or whatever, and find a little single mapper somewhere that I can mess around with it for a while without having to commit to some huge thing. So I might be doing that and jumping backwards and forwards between that and some musket and pike and so on, and maybe a bit of Fire in the Lake and whatever else takes my fancy. But anyway, I'm rattling on about that when I should be talking about this. This is a fantastic game. I said it during one of the videos, but I really like the sort of level that it's pitched at. It's got the strategy elements and it has tactical elements, and the two fit together like cogs. They're just really neatly interwoven. So you're thinking about one and you suddenly find yourself thinking about the other, and you can move backwards and forwards quite comfortably between them, and that's really enjoyable. I like the fact that the counter density is low, that it's not fiddly. I like these sortie markers that are used to keep track of how much work your Air Force and Navies are doing and how effective they are. They represent a sort of workload on your units, and they get less and less and less effective, as you can see, until they become entirely unable to act, and that really works quite nicely. It represents sort of air and naval units as in a more sort of factors of economy and rather than just pure combat losses. The way the production points work, the fact that you have these production points down here, you can see the Soviets with a huge amount left because they hardly took any of their turn, but they're on 54 there. But every time you move an armoured or motorised unit, it costs you 2. Every time you move an infantry unit, it costs you 1. Every time you want to add some sorties onto your aircrafts, that costs you 3. Onto your bombers costs you 4. Onto your aircraft carriers costs you 5. And so everything is a function of production. And it really does, I mean, at this late war stage where the Russians are kicking around with 58 points a turn, they're pretty much not having to worry about production points anymore. But throughout most of the game, every country is heavily constrained by its production points, and you really are having to think, you know, there's absolutely no way that the Germans can attack across the entire front, even at its high point. They're having to pick 4 or 5 or 6 good attacks that they like the look of if they want to be keeping their air force in the air and building their units and so on. And political chits before the total war has kicked in, political chits are costing you 5 a time as well. So that's an extremely user-friendly and pleasing part of the game. It's very simple conceptually to keep track of production points, and yet it just acts as this limiter on what you can do all the time, and it just prompts interesting decisions whenever you're looking at what you want to do. So that's nice. Something I've not really mentioned at any point during the game is all these kind of chits that all the countries get. You've got you know, these markers that they can have, surprise attacks and airdrops and heavy artillery, and you can see partisans, well, you could, if I pointed the camera at them, partisans and ultra and a German airdrop in there, and all kinds of stuff that the sides get, and you get to throw these in on your behalf into battles. So you can see tanks, that turns infantry units into armoured units for a dice roll, so it basically gives them the +2 or +1 that armour would have, and it comes, that green 1T means it comes back a turn later. And then you've got ground support, which the Germans can throw in on behalf of its allies and gives them a +1, and the little dice on it means it comes back. That you know, the roll of a dice turns later, so if they roll a 4, it's 4 months later it comes back, and so on. And similarly, you know, the allies have got similar ground support and tanks and more tanks, and the Russians have got more ground support, and surface actions act like a temporary navy, or a temporary naval unit, and so on. And those just again, they're little modifiers that you can put into battle, and it's about committing resources or not committing resources. You know, do you need them for later? Where are they best used? And it might just be a +1 on the dice or a +2 on the dice, but when early in the game, when these German panzer units are rolling across green Russian infantry, +2 on the dice is huge. So you know, they have to try and think about where to use those very, very limited resources, and it just adds another layer of plausibility to the game and what's going on, and some theme and flavour, you know, because you've got ultra markers, so you know they represent, again, you know, they may just be a +1 on the dice, or they may be a bonus on your strategic war dice. So it's using the same mechanics and giving it different names and some flavour, but it's just adding another layer of sort of plausible decision making without a great deal of complexity or overhead. You know, adding a +1 on the die roll by throwing a chit in and then placing it a d6 turns later on the turn marker is extremely simple. You know, this is not difficult rules, and yet it just adds a lovely addition to the game and the ebb and flow of the game, and you can make good decisions about when to use your markers. You can hoard them for sort of big offensives. You can time when to spend them so that you spend them in May and hope to roll low on the dice so that you get them back throughout the summer. You can be making interesting decisions about how to use these things, and that's another element that I really like. This game isn't too complex. There is a reasonable amount of it and quite a lot to remember, but it is, once you get into the flow of it, it's extremely pleasant and easy to play, and it frees up your mind just for decision making about how you want to play and what you're trying to achieve each turn, rather than grappling with the rule book and the tables. It's got one combat table on it, and you learn pretty quickly that any sort of result that looks like it's evens isn't going to do anything, and you start to learn very quickly these sort of results in here that are the main ones that you're going to be getting turn by turn. So again, by the time you've finished a game, you'll be throwing the dice, adding up the modifiers, and you'll know the result off the top of your head without really needing to look it up. And again, that just makes it extremely easy to keep playing and keep moving forward without constantly scrabbling around looking at charts and cross-referencing things. And again, that in my book is a bonus. I have nothing against games with huge amounts of charts and tables. I've played enough ASL to know what it's like to be looking at charts and tables all the time, but it's also refreshing to be playing something where that isn't required. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, but that has been an awful lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed playing it. I've really enjoyed videoing it and rambling on about it, so I'm going to close this down and upload it. Ta very much.